We have our second ever live show, which is taking place on the 11th of December in Tottenham in North London. And it's a Christmas special, Gary.
It's Wednesday, 11th of December at the Bernie Grant Arts Centre in Tottenham. Tickets start from £8. We will also be joined by a special guest to be announced soon. Bring your mince pies. We're going to have a do. 11th of December, Bernie Grant Arts Centre, Tottenham.
Hi, I'm Carys of Foco.
And I'm Gary Young, and this is Over the Top, Under the Radar.
For this episode, I sat down with Joe Mulhall, who's the Director of Research at Hope Not Hate, to talk about the organisation's work and his new book, Rebel Sounds. Hi, Joe. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Good to see you. How's things?
Yeah, pretty good. Really excited to have you on the show. And before we jump into it, could you just explain to our listeners who do not know what Hope Not Hate is, what the organisation does and what your job is?
Yeah, sure. So Hope Not Hate is an anti-fascist organisation. We've been around for about 20 years, or depending on how you look at it, 50, 60 years. And we combine researching the far right. We kind of monitor on a day-to-day basis who they are, what they're up to, what they're planning. Take that research and we have a campaign arm which campaigns during elections or in communities. We have a policy team. But broadly speaking, it's about finding who the far right are and how we reduce their impact on society.
How did you end up doing this sort of work? What brought you into researching the far right? Tell us a bit about you.
I'd finished university and I was in a really, really bad band. And I was living in kind of Camden. And
what type of music?
I thought we were the greatest kind of. It was that indie time in Camden. You know what I mean? It was all skinny jeans and
okay, skinny jeans. Lots of hair. Okay.
And I thought, I thought we were the best band ever. And it turns out, of course, we were absolute garbage. And so I wasn't making any money. And so I was subletting a council flat and eating tins of peaches. And it was running up into the 2010 general election. And I had no time for the Labour Party, or certainly not the Conservative Party either. But I knew that the BNP were quite strong in East London. And so I started to volunteer for Hope Not Hate. And they were running this massive campaign out in Dagenham. And then I just ended up going every day for 9 months. Went off and did a PhD on the British far right so I could come back onto our research team.
And you talked about far right, and obviously that has been a phrase that we've heard a lot after the events of the summer. How does Hope Not Hate define far right?
Far right, yeah, it's one of those unhelpful terms in one sense. It's a very broad term. It's an umbrella term, right, which goes from the right of the Conservative Party through to neo-Nazis, etc. So we actually split it in two. We have the radical right, which is ostensibly groups and individuals that remain democratic in some sense, but they challenge the main bits of liberal democracy. And then you have the extreme far right, which are fundamentally anti-democratic. And all of them, there's commonalities. There's usually like an in-group, which is on the more moderate end is a cultural in-group, British culture. And then there's a threat from external people, usually Muslims nowadays. And on the more extreme end, it's racially defined. So it's an understanding that there is a racial in-group, the white people, and an external enemy, which is people of colour from all different backgrounds.
And just in terms of, so that was really helpful to hear those two sort of camps within the far right. Where would someone like Tommy Robinson or Stephen Yaxley Lennon, I think is his real name, where would he fit in that definition?
Well, it's a really interesting one, actually, right? I mean, technically, he's traditionally, you'd be what people call like a civic nationalist, or that's how they would describe him in the far right. His idea was this: it doesn't matter what colour you are, it's about the culture. It's about Muslims are a threat to Western culture and Western history and identity, etc. But as we know, underlying all of that is inherently a racism to Tommy Robinson, a much more extreme racism. He increasingly talks about his major concern is that white Anglo-Saxons are being replaced. So he's increasingly shifted right on those issues. He's also, over the years, crossed lines around anti-Semitism and Jewish control, etc. But primarily he sits in that camp where for him the big threat, as he sees it, is Islam and Muslims are consciously invading or taking over Britain and the West. And he talks regularly that he's not racist, is how he would define himself. It's not about races. And yet, of course, he increasingly slips up where he will talk about people of colour. That really came to the fore during the Black Lives Matter protests some years ago. When he was talking, it became evidently clear that there was a much broader racial politics sitting underneath his cultural discussion.
How much do you think nowadays is there an element of concealment or deception where people like Tommy Robinson, or I don't know, Nigel Farage, are sort of openly, I'm not racist, this isn't about race. It's almost a sort of mask that occasionally slips. Or do you think they genuinely believe that they aren't racists?
I mean, I think in one sense what's scary If I think back to when I started in anti-fascist politics like 15 years ago, it was groups like the British National Party. They front-facing would say one thing, but you knew at the core it was a much more extreme form of politics. Nowadays, unfortunately, a lot of far-right rhetoric and politics has just become so much more normalized and much more mainstream. Terms and phraseology that would have traditionally been or recently been confined to the extreme margins on the far right, we hear it in the mainstream of our politics, whether or not that was Suella Braverman talking about invasion in the House of Commons. These were things that actually, even just 15 years ago, the BNP, publicly at least, would have been slightly nervous. And, Nigel Farage is a great example of this. There's a very, very small fringe fascist group called Patriotic Alternative, led by a guy called Mark Collett, who used to be a big name in the BNP. And during the recent election, he said, Nigel Farage is saying things that we could have never have got away with in 2010. We knew that it would have marginalized us too when he's talking about demographics and those sorts of things. So the far right is not a tumor that hangs off our body politic, and if we just lop it off, everything else is fine. Far right politics is a gangrenous limb within our politics that poisons it. There is a symbiotic relationship between the mainstream of our politics, what we hear in our newspapers, what we hear worryingly increasingly in our parliamentary chamber, and then there is these groups on the far right. Often it's a matter of presentation rather than politics difference,
Is your sense then that what's happened in the last 15 years is that across all of our politics, ideas that would have before been unacceptable have been mainstreamed?
A lot of the data suggests that attitudes towards minority communities and immigration have actually got better over that period and increasingly got more progressive. But there, of course, has then been a backlash against that. Part of the issue is how normal and acceptable it is. Let's look at the recent riots as an example. This was the most extreme period of far-right violence we've seen in the whole post-war period. Now, lots of people talk about misinformation and disinformation, and that is important, right? But no one who threw a brick at a mosque or tried to burn to death asylum seekers in accommodation didn't have a problem with Muslims and asylum seekers before that horrifying attack in Southport happened and just flipped the next day. They were already inculcated with a politics of prejudice and discrimination, and that is through that drip effect. The reason that they believed the disinformation that it was a Muslim or an asylum seeker or someone who'd arrived on a boat was because they were already inculcated with that prejudice. And some of that is people like Tommy Robinson saying those things online. Some of that is the role of social media, of course. But the other thing is decades of headlines on mainstream newspapers, or increasingly, unfortunately, over the last 5 years, the rhetoric coming out of mainstream politicians in our government that has normalized a way of looking at asylum seekers and Muslims especially, but not just that, all people of colour across society are marginalised and attacked by those mainstream outlets and organs as well.
So I'm glad you touched on the riots. I think for a lot of us, what happened in August sort of seemingly triggered by the tragic killings of 3 young girls in Southport, it felt like something came out of nowhere. And I guess one of the reasons we were really keen to talk to you is that I'm guessing it wasn't such a surprise to you. Can you explain what you think happened, how much it was connected to the killings, and like who the people were that we saw out on the streets in like dozens of areas across the UK?
Really sadly, it didn't make it any less shocking, but it wasn't surprising. We at Hope Not Hate for some years had been warning that something like this was going to happen, especially around accommodation, housing people who are seeking asylum. The scale took everyone by surprise. It was the third explosion, if you will, of this wellspring of anger in British society at the moment. This was not long after the general election where Nigel Farage's reform got 14.3% of the vote, over 4 million votes, which is the largest probably radical right, far right vote share of the post-war period. The riots came a few days after Tommy Robinson or Stephen Lennon had a demonstration in Trafalgar Square that had somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people on it. That was probably certainly the largest far-right demonstration in years in the UK. And then we have the riots, which is the largest explosion of far-right violence in the post-war period. These 3 events are all ostensibly symptoms of this kind of wellspring of anger and resentment and hatred bubbling away under British society. What was really horrifying about the riots, but also, I guess, interesting, maybe that's not the right word, but they reflected what the modern far-right looks like, right? And by that, I mean, yes, we've analysed thousands of hours of footage and images to find out who people are, who was organising what. Yes, there was people from small far-right groups like Britain First, Patriotic Alternative, former English Defence League members, etc. on these events. But there was no single group or person that organised all of these demonstrations. Rather, what it is, it mimics what we call the post-organisational far-right. And by that, I just mean, in addition to those traditional groups that has a leader, a regional structure, branch members, and all those sorts of things, is this massive decentralized network of thousands of individuals that are engaging with and creating far-right material, primarily online, but as we've seen in the riots, can happen offline. And it's like a school of fish that moves around the internet. There's no leader, you're not a member of anything. While there's not a leader, there are figureheads, people like Tommy Robinson, that direct the weather of this school of fish, if you will, around the internet. So when you looked at the riots, that 7-day period, many of them looked very similar. They would chant the same things at the events, similar sorts of targets. They would have the same banners, the same poster styles, which gives the impression that there's someone organising it all, but it wasn't. It was individuals locally, ad hoc, creating their own events, but they were somehow linked into these overlapping online spaces. So the riots very much echoed what the far right looks like. And it's why I think lots of the media got it wrong when they said these people aren't far right. They're not a member of anything. You don't need to be a member of anything anymore to either consume or engage with a form of far right activism. And for me, the moment you turn up outside a mosque and start chanting racist slogans or you throw a brick, you're engaging in far right activism, even if you don't have a membership card for anything.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things I found quite concerning and upsetting about some of the mainstream media coverage of this sense of like, well, these people aren't all racist or on the far right, even though they're trying to burn people alive and threatening physical acts of violence. I think it was really interesting you said about the shift to a more decentralized structure. Am I right in saying that 20 years ago, you might have been a member of the British National Party and you would have, had a local branch and maybe an organizational structure. And now you're saying that there isn't one group or one umbrella and it's much more fragmented, but that people are organizing or consuming the same content on social media. So the people that took to the streets might not have known each other, or they would have known each other from online forums. Like, what is there? Who were the people that were out on the streets?
You're absolutely right. 20 years ago, or prior to the digital age, if you will, if you wanted to engage in far-right activism actively, you either had to go through a phone book and call people that you think might be involved, or you might have to go to a city to maybe go and you've heard that there's a street store where they're handing out leaflets. If you want to get hold of really extreme books or material like Holocaust denial, you'd have to write a letter to somewhere in America that would send you. All of these things were hurdles to far-right activism. Now, of course, as long as you've got internet connection, you can sit anywhere in the world and you can consume far-right material at the click of a button. I mean, unfortunately, in some social media platforms serve it up to you, even if you're not looking for it. Traditionally, people would say this person is a member of the far right because they are a member of the National Front or a member of the English Defence League or the BNP. Now, people can sit watching Tommy Robinson videos, become inculcated with really extreme views about Muslims or asylum seekers, and genuinely say, I'm not far right, I'm not a member of anything. And I think that's also, that ease of entry is why so many young people are getting involved. Because if you're 14, you can consume it now without having to go and knock on a door.
Yeah, it's really terrifying. And so for Hope Not Hate, which, has existed for decades now, what does this shift that you described of far-right movements and far-right activism shifting in the digital age to more decentralized, more about sort of clusters of people consuming content online, content traveling around the world. How does Hope Not Hate organise in that context, and what does that mean for your work?
Yeah, there's no question it adds a whole layer of complexity, right? Sometimes we'll come across, say, a Telegram channel engaging in really, really extreme behaviour, often perhaps even talking about specific places of worship, etc. And we will spend weeks, in some cases, trying to find out who those individuals are operating anonymously. And it turns out it's a 14-year-old sat in Lithuania. And so it creates a whole extra layer of complexity there. I mean, the good side is that all of the things that social media is used for ill, those tools are also open for positive use. We all have our ability to speak to our supporters, to engage with people that are progressive and dislike this politics, that want to get involved, that want to change the narrative. These networks are really important, but we can't forget that Reform got over 4 million votes in that last election, and they're building branches around the country, and they're a very traditional looking threat. This is a group that I would argue fits comfortably in any definition of far right, certainly radical right populist. Their aim is to set up over 120 branches this year around the country. And that's going to be causing real problems on the streets in communities. And Hope Not Hate, in that space, we know what to do there. Our job will be to be in those communities that are susceptible to far-right politics as well. We'll have organisers there from those communities, so that when we have local elections next year, Welsh elections the year after, and the general election in 5 years' time, we are in the same communities on those same streets trying to offer more positive solutions, really.
It sounds like in terms of what has stayed the same is the way that we tackle the far right. Do you want to talk a bit about the kind of things that Hope Not Hate does that are effective in tackling far-right politics?
One of the elements is almost like a form of investigative journalism. One of the major dangers we face is the normalization of far-right people and politics. Thankfully, the far-right remains a real minority in British society still, and most people find the more extreme views abhorrent still. And so our job is shining a light on those things. Our job is finding out what these people are actually believing, what they're actually planning, and telling people about it. Because they'll sometimes present a more moderate picture to the world, but when you're in the room and no one's listening, they tell the truth. And our job is to expose that thing. So part of our work, for example, is doing infiltrations of the far right. My job for many years was going to far right events, and we still have people that do that. So that when no one's listening, or they think no one's listening, we're there and we can tell the world about how extreme they are. And that'll often marginalize them and reduce their impact. But on the other side, it's a much broader thing. You know, we have community groups that have been going for decades in places like Bradford who are rooted in that community, and everything from food banks to election periods when we will be campaigning on the doors. We take that information and we use data nowadays, like everyone uses data, to identify how is it that we split away the people that are susceptible to far-right politics from the people that are propagating far-right politics. And together you can kind of hopefully split them apart, make one less important and make one less likely to engage in far-right politics.
And are there particular groups at this point in time that are more susceptible to far-right politics, more likely to start getting served far-right content on their social media algorithms?
It sounds trite to say it, but obviously white disenfranchised, primarily men. And one of the things that came up in the riots, for example, people were saying, aren't they right to be angry? And in one sense, you can empathise with that position, but none of that justifies the attacking of a mosque or an asylum seeker accommodation. There are whole areas of this country that are right to be furious about the state of the country. Hospitals, houses, schools, jobs, cost of living crisis. All of these things are really, really real. And the status quo, mainstream political parties are not offering them answers and making their lives materially better. And the far right then turn up to those communities and give them a really easy answer to a really complex set of questions and say, yep, it's not the fault of the politicians, etc. It's the fault of these people over here that have come and taken your jobs, come and taken your money. They're being put up in nice hotels. That kind of scapegoating politics. That's why those communities are susceptible to it. And I think while we should never, ever excuse far-right activism, we have to understand that as well as all the things that we do at Hope Not Hate, for example, we need to deal with the material needs of those communities. You know, we need politicians that are going to go in and make sure that there isn't a cost of living crisis, make sure that they do have houses and schools and hospitals and those things. If you can remove the scarcity, then the far-right's job is much, much harder when they try to play on those communities. There's a reason the far-right target Dagenham, Burnley, Stoke, Rotherham, Rochdale. These are towns that have been poorly treated by political parties for decades now, and the far right go into them and try to whip up the anger that's there and direct the anger towards asylum seekers or Muslims or people of colour.
Obviously, the riots were getting a lot of media coverage, and, you know, for a week in August, suddenly the thing that you work on every day was blown up and, you know, in the mainstream. Was there anything that annoyed you or like frustrated you about the coverage? Was there anything that the media got wrong that you wished you could have been like, excuse me, this isn't right?
The big one was, and this actually kind of touches on something we mentioned earlier, which was after the first riot in Southport on the first night, there was lots of media coverage talking about, should we ban the English Defence League? And the English Defence League are the people that are behind the riots. Now, the English Defence League doesn't exist. Tommy Robinson ran it between 2009, 2013. It dribbled on for a few years, maybe 15, 16, but it doesn't exist anymore. And this was part of the issue, because it is slightly more complex to talk about the far right as these decentralised post-organisational networks. They turned around and just framed it as the English Defence League. And then the problem of that is they then asked politicians, what do we do about the EDL? And the politicians started saying we should ban the English Defence League. And so we then spend a huge amount of time having a conversation about whether or not we ban a group that doesn't exist, which will have zero effect on what we're seeing on the streets. And so that kind of slightly unnuanced reporting on it and the way it was discussed becomes really unhelpful, because even people that want to do good are then spending a huge amount of time talking about something that doesn't exist. The other thing that was perhaps, I think, probably more detrimental in the long term was this idea that this was legitimate anger. And I kind of mentioned a minute ago what I mean by legitimate anger, which is angry at the state of their lives, their country, etc. But the problem is that was very quickly shifted to legitimate action, as in you can't be surprised that these people are behaving in this way. There's some sort of legitimateness there. Yes, we obviously don't like them trying to burn to death people, but there was lots of people actually that weren't far right at all. And that was just extremely unhelpful. And that narrative has become much more widespread. Let's not forget the Southport attack, a horrifying attack. It wasn't a Muslim. Not that it would justify if it was, but it wasn't a Muslim. For me, however angry you are, if you decide to then go and protest outside a mosque that has nothing to do with the attack at all, you're engaging in a form of far-right politics. There's no legitimacy to throwing a brick, to screaming a racist slogan, or to firebombing a hotel. And the speed with which that became legitimized in elements of the media was horrifying. And the speed with which it has now disappeared. This is the biggest schism of far-right violence in the post-war period. When was the last time you heard us talk about it? And it's just disappeared. Yet there's a few extremists, they're in prison now, we can all move on like nothing happened. Like it wasn't an articulation of widespread societal racism,
Yeah, and you're right. I think even taking a slightly longer term view of looking to the reform vote in the July general election and joining a dot to that is something that really felt lacking in a lot of media coverage. What would you say to people of colour who were sort of hit with this wave of images of violence and protests on social media and who rightly so felt a lot less safe and a lot more scared?
I mean, all I can say in these situations is kind of obviously solidarity. And I mean, I'm white passing. I don't experience these things in the same way. When I speak to my friends from a whole range of communities, the terror of what that 10-day period was is something I find really hard to understand. The CEO at Hope Not Hate, Nick Lowles, he talks about his childhood, about how he didn't quite know what was happening, but he'd see the National Front on television and presume that meant they were going to get rid of his mother. And there'll be a whole raft of children out there that saw this going on and thought, is this my country? And that's going to have huge amounts of tail and legacy. And that's, by the way, why a lot of these far-right activists do this. They want to scare people like this. The important thing, which we're trying to do more of at Hope Not Hate, and obviously we've got a very diverse team internally, is trying to understand those things better. Because I think sometimes it's easy to get your head down and go, we look at these Nazis, we look at this person throwing a brick, and not, as you say, as you describe it, this long tail.
And I guess the antidote, if there is one, was things like the mobilisation in Walthamstow, right, where thousands of people came out onto the streets. I think it's interesting you said that, one of the designed impacts of these mobilisations is to make people scared and to make them feel like the streets aren't theirs or they aren't safe on them. So is that the kind of antidote? I know Hope Not Hate's done lots of community organising for decades on different projects, but do you think taking to the streets is another way that we try and reclaim them and make it clear that they are in a minority?
Yeah, look, I mean, after that 7 days, no one had slept. I Hope Not Hate, and to see them people come out on the streets there was just this hugely energizing thing, And even like the Daily Mail wrote positive things about those protests and stuff, and it was amazing. And I wouldn't for one second say it wasn't amazing, and what that meant for those communities. The danger is if we become complacent, right? It was amazing to see so many people in Walthamstow and Bristol. But what we need to do as a kind of anti-racist, anti-fascist movement is, how do we get those numbers in Rochdale, in Rotherham, in Hull? We saw big protests counter protests in Liverpool, as you'd expect, proud history of that sort of stuff. The danger is it's relatively easy to mobilize big numbers of progressive people in progressive areas or certainly middle class areas. The real work is that we can't then turn around and go, job done, we finished the riots because we all met in Walthamstow. Like, how do we actually go into the communities that are most susceptible to far-right politics and engage and listen and win person by person there? And how do we mobilize progressive numbers? And how do we protect those communities?
You talked a little bit about some of the tropes that are mobilizing and energizing people now. So it sounds like a lot of the focus of the anger and energy at the moment is around the Muslim community in Britain, is around small boats or asylum seekers. Are there other sort of specific tropes or like hot button issues?
Well, it's one of the things that was really terrifying about, obviously that horrifying attack happens against those young girls. The next day in Southport, the riot that happens, the rhetoric on there was primarily about protecting those girls, for example, protecting young girls, as they would have described it. The speed with which that wave of violence over the next 7 days spreads out to a wider set of far-right grievances, that attack in Southport turned into a trigger to unleash a wider set of grievances. And as you say, I mean, broad, like the way the targets of those were primarily Muslims or asylum seekers, or people in their eyes that look or sound Muslim, look or sound like an asylum seeker. People were stopping cars and pulling people of colour out of them. They weren't checking if they were an asylum seeker. Not that would have been okay anyway. But it unleashed a wider set of grievances. The way a lot of it was framed was they've been given money. This is a really important thing at the moment. They've been put up in a 4-star hotel while we're struggling to heat our homes, or we're struggling to feed our children, or there's homeless veterans on the street and they're being given there. So a lot of it is couched in that set of that notion of scarcity.
And the idea that the hotels are a resource that aren't available to so-called local people.
Yeah, exactly. And in certain communities, I mean, these hotels have been targeted for 4 years now by the far-right activists, And in certain communities, it was the only place where, 50 people lost their job when those hotels were turned into accommodation. No one thinks, The refugee and asylum sector don't think those hotels are a good idea either, by the way, locking people away in hotels. The other element here was about, and I think taps into it, was this notion, this of invasion. It's about change. There's this idea that Britain has changed, that there was some mythical past even. Britain has changed and it's now unsafe for people like us. The boats, in some sense, is the symptom in their view. This is like we're being invaded by these people, but they're taking over. They're taking away things that should be ours. And what Britain looks like and is being changed, and we're not having a say on it. And so that's a broader narrative, and that means that's why they're targeting that. But it also means why, one of the big elements of the far right, less so in the riots, but more broadly, is a huge attack on the trans community, for example. Like this broader anti-woke politics that you see that gets lots of traction within the far right. Very, very quickly, there was a range of grievances that spilled out into that violence that we saw there. I mean, look, even after it was made clear by the police that the alleged attacker was not an asylum seeker or not a Muslim, many of the main figures said, well, it doesn't matter. That's not why we're actually here. The point stands. We have to protect our children against people of colour, against asylum seekers that are invading and taking it. It's irrelevant that wasn't done by an asylum seeker. And it's all wrapped into those traditional things of people of colour being a sexual and violent threat and a threat to children. These tropes that go back hundreds of years,
So in that sense, the sort of core story hasn't changed from like 20, 30, 50 years ago, but the specific plot points or ways that you illustrate the story might have changed. So now it's hotels full of asylum seekers. It's the number of mosques that there are in the UK. But that core story of the threat to white British people hasn't changed that much, just the way that it's illustrated now.
Yeah, I mean, I always kind of describe it as like my PhD was on the 1940s and the far right in the 1940s and 50s in the UK. But I always kind of describe it as most of the far right, certainly the core activists, hate all these groups. Do you know what I mean? Like they hate women, they hate people of colour, they hate LGBT people.
Down with them all.
They hate them all. But what they do is they realise that if they're going to get traction in the mainstream, they will adopt the prejudice front and centre that they think is most likely to gain them traction. So, in the 1920s and 30s, the far right would talk mostly about Jews and through to the 1940s. Post-Holocaust, that begins to shift where they're talking more about Indians and people arriving from the Caribbean. The tropes are the same, sexual threat to our women, but they start talking more publicly, overtly about black people in the 50s and 60s because they think that's the trope that is going to get the most mainstream attraction because that was a mainstream racist view across society. Post Salman Rushdie affair and post 9/11, you start to see that they're talking more overtly about Muslims because that's the group they think that everyone hates. And then now they're talking more specifically about asylum seekers taking our things. Behind that, those more extreme groups are still anti-Semitic. They're still racist against black people. They're still racist against all these different groups. But the one they talk about most publicly is the one they think is going to be most beneficial to them.
Yeah, it's a bit chilling how opportunist and pragmatic these so-called ideological movements are. And you guys are the subject of a documentary, which I think people will be able to watch, to stream on Channel 4.
Yes. I keep saying 4OD. That hasn't existed for like a decade, has it? But whatever.
No, I did the same a few times. All for 4OD. It can be streamed on Channel 4's platforms.
Yeah, it's great. It's called Undercover. For the first time ever, we let a camera crew in to Hope Not Hate, and not for obvious reasons, because the far right can be very violent. We're very protective. My first 5 years at Hope Not Hate, I didn't even know where the office was. I used to work out of a trade union office. And so we'd never let people in before. And for a couple of years, a film crew kind of followed us. And there's a couple of strands. One is it follows the story of a really brave undercover journalist called Harry Schuckman, who's now come out publicly and works for us. And he went and explored race science networks around the world and exposed how these kind of millionaire Silicon Valley investors are funneling money into race science and trying to rebirth eugenics politics and really, really nasty stuff. And he did some extremely brave work. And so it follows that story of these secret conferences, etc. And he manages to find out who one of the big funders is. It also follows kind of Hope Not Hate's seemingly endless running battle with Tommy Robinson and then also just some of the other sides of Hope Not Hate. So it's a beautiful film made by a remarkable filmmaker called Havana Marking, who's won the Sundance before, and she's really brilliant. And so it's a great looking film as well. I'm not going to say it's an easy watch, but I think I think we're all really proud of it. So I'm glad it's out there now.
I guess the other thing that it's worth people being aware of is that the reality of your day job and the organisation's focus being far right organisations means there is quite a big risk to Hope Not Hate as an organisation. And part of the reason you guys need our support is that you're very visible anti-fascist. So what's that like day to day?
Yeah, I mean, it's a sad kind of byproduct of I say the work, it's not really a job, but it's like of the activism. And one of the stories in the film is recently a guy's just gone to prison. He managed to get hold of my address and a colleague of mine, their addresses, and he bought a gun. He's now gone to prison, but they managed to catch him buying the gun and stuff. And he was, and he got hold of our addresses and he was sending us stuff. So it's just part of it. The film itself was selected for the London Film Festival and they decided not to screen it because they were concerned about security for it.
How do you deal with that? Someone getting hold of your address?
It's the address stuff is difficult, more difficult than most. There's been times when they've published my parents' details, and in some senses that's harder because they didn't sign up for this stuff, but it's really hard, and we were getting takeaways delivered to our houses all the time just so that to tell us that they knew where we lived, and it's much worse for my colleague Nick. But
oh my God, what people deliberately doing it to show I know where you live.
Yeah, so you get 5-10 takeaways turn up in a night sort of thing. And unfortunately, they hadn't paid for them. So it wasn't even like massive.
Didn't even get free pizza from these racists.
No.
Okay, and then what does that mean? So in terms of your day-to-day life, does that mean you just have to be a lot more security conscious, privacy conscious?
Yeah, we take it really, really seriously, security. We don't have a public office, for example, because we can't have anyone finding out where the office is. So we take all those sorts of things seriously. Also, just how people stay safe online, you just change the way you live slightly. You don't put anything out there saying can't wait to go to the theatre tomorrow night because you never know what happens. So you change what you put out there, what images of yourself you go out there, and you always just have slightly more cautious, and we've got internally every day. This week, for example, we're doing full sweeps on everyone who works for us just to make sure there's nothing out there, no threats, etc. So
what's a full sweep, just to explain for listeners?
So we'll look through every social week, kind of monitor, I think maybe 12-15 different social media platforms. And so we'll just go through them all to make sure that no one on any of those platforms is talking about a specific person or a specific location or address and those sorts of things. And, and it's been horrible. I've had graffiti outside my house. My boss, Nick's, had people turn up at his kid's school. And, it's a nasty side of it. But in one sense, we do what we do because these people are engaged, that are hateful and are engaging in nasty stuff. And in another sense, if they're coming, when they're coming for us, they're not going for the local mosque or they're not going for the local synagogue or whatever it is. So in some sense, if there's any ability that Hope Not Hate can draw fire from these people, it hopefully makes things slightly better. But it's just kind of part of the day-to-day experience, really, of being at Hope Not Hate, really. Although if we are ever hiring, it is amazing as well. I don't want anyone to come away from this thinking, God, that sounds awful. It's a really, that you get to feel like you're doing something. And I think that's what makes it all worthwhile, really.
So tell us about the book. You've written a book about music and resistance.
Yeah, it's called Rebel Sounds, Music as Resistance. It traces how music's been used within resistance movements. So certainly over the last 100 years, that could be against colonialism, everything from like Irish rebel songs to anti-apartheid music in South Africa, jazz, blues and soul in the civil rights struggle, Fela Kuti in Nigeria, right the way through up to, rock and roll behind the Iron Curtain, right the way through to Ukraine right now and electronic music in like bomb shelters, raves in bomb shelters. And the book, I travel to all these places over the last couple of years, and I kind of go and interview the musicians or go to the recording studios. And so part of it is like the story of those oppressive movements, whether or not that's apartheid or British colonialism or the current war in Ukraine. But then it's like, how is music being used and how has it been used as a form of resistance? And that could be, I thought it would just be protest songs like Billy Bragg and nothing, Billy Bragg's in the book, obviously. Do you know what I mean? Obviously he is. He's on the front cover, in fact. But as well as that, like how much broader resistance music is. Sometimes it was just listening to a song you were told you weren't allowed to. It might not be a political, like listening to the Beatles Behind the Iron Curtain was an act of resistance, even though the song was about love. Or listening to purely electronic music and dancing in a bomb shelter in Kiev, because for those 3 hours, you've forgotten about the war and you feel like you're human again. Or singing a song in a prison in Robben Island in South Africa, just singing a song that reminds you that they're trying to treat us like animals, but we're actually humans, And so it's a broad understanding of what is resistance movements. It's just anything basically that could be used that made people feel that they could change the world,
Oh, that's lovely. And are you still playing music? You still in a band?
No, I don't know. I live in a flat now, so I'm a drummer. So it doesn't stop my neighbour playing his guitar really loud. But so I did think about maybe getting a kit and getting my own back, but no.
Gary, you couldn't make the conversation, but you've listened to it. What did you think?
Well, I thought it was interesting. Most interesting to me was his analysis of how the far right operated over the summer, in that there was no central organizing tool. There was no one entity running it. It kind of emerged, caffeinated through the internet as a kind of hydra-headed beast. And that's interesting to me because I think there is an analogy there with how Black Lives Matter emerged. There's no one central organizing power or place. There was no institution. There was a kind of latent political community that was then galvanized into action, which is how he described it. These people were thinking this before, then they had a chance to act on it. And it feels like the way that a certain kind of movement operates, which is a kind of homeless, web-based, leaderless interventions, which make a massive impact but have no kind of organizational center. And it was interesting to me to hear how that was also true of the right, the far right.
Yeah, it's funny you said that. BLM came into my head when Joe was talking. I didn't ask him about it. But yeah, that sense of BLM is a hashtag, right? And that you can turn up on a BLM demo, and a lot of people did, not a member of something. So yeah, the idea that this is a trend across the political spectrum, that there are these looser ties to causes, but that they can get you out in the street, was something that I found really interesting. And just the fact that like the EDL doesn't exist anymore, which is not what you hear from politicians. To be honest as well, it was, I mean, I've really am always full of admiration for people who do the work that people like Joe do. But that threat, the physical threat, I don't know, the fact that fascists sent takeaways to your house, the fact they had to cancel a screening of the documentary because it wasn't safe. I think that very real danger posed by the far right, I think, was something that, stayed with me from the interview.
I liked the way, would probably be a misnomer, but I thought it was interesting the way that he made those connections between the more violent, clearly ideologically driven fascist and the potential for organizations like Reform, and the connections between them, and the kind of idea that in some ways Reform, while more scary, also they want to set up a series of hubs, and then Hope Not Hate will know where they are, and they will be able to kind of engage with those places, which will be a kind of more known strategy than trying to deal. He mentioned you're looking for the provenance of some kind of hate campaign online, and you find out after a while that it's a 14-year-old in Lithuania, and that it's so much more difficult to track. So there is this way in which Reform both presents a bigger threat and that it is possible to locate it in a way that you can't locate the other things.
I thought that was, to be honest, the fact that he was very clear-eyed about what the Reform vote was and joined the dots between that and the riots was disturbing, but also it was just quite reassuring to hear, because I think there's a lot of, and we'll see it a lot from the political centre, this sort of legitimising the Reform vote and appealing to the Reform vote. So I thought it was helpful to hear someone who's got a PhD in fascism say, call a spade a spade. Yeah, I think the other thing that really struck me is a moment where he talks about a former BNP lieutenant saying that Farage is managing to get away with saying things they couldn't have dreamed of 10 years ago. And that shift in the political mainstream and what has been legitimized, I thought was very powerful. That, and just the opportunism of fascists and how they adapt to focus on Muslim communities, to focus on the small boats, how parasitic and effective far right groups are at sort of jumping on waves and making opportunities out of things that are happening.
The way that Overton window has widened about what and how people might say. Because to me, it's not just what Reform say, it's also what can be said. And he did mention this, like Braverman talking about the invasion, the way that feeds into the body politic. I mean, he described it as it's not like a tumor, it's more like a kind of gangrenous leg that kind of, and the infection spreading throughout the body. I kind of like to describe it as like arsenic in the water supply. It's coming from higher and higher points. So it's not like this group of people invented British racism, but they're a product of it, and they're managing to amplify it in a way that wasn't possible before. But also their rhetoric is coming from almost every level. and each one reinforces the other.
Yeah, well, it's a good conversation. Let us know what you think of it. Hope Not Hate are very visible. You can find them online. Thank you so much to Joe Mulhall. His book, Rebel Sounds, is out now at all good bookstores.
And thanks for listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts.
You can sign up to our newsletter at overunderpod.com.
If you want to support the show, find us by searching Over the Top, Under the Radar on Patreon.
And you can connect with us on social media. We are at over_under_pod_.